Okay, we're beginning Chapter 4, Money, the Ultimate Instrument of Tragedy and Hope 101. Antiquity presents everywhere the spectacle of a few men molding mankind according to their whims, thanks to the prestige of force and fraud. Frederick Bastiat. Hopefully by now we've established the fact that a small, powerful, and secretive group can alter the course of world history. Additionally, we've established that this form of coercive power, hidden, dishonest, and dangerous, is nothing new. It existed thousands of years ago. It existed hundreds of years ago. It exists today. Only the names, sophistication, and reach of the instruments have changed. Since this form of power is inherently illegitimate, we need no further justification to free ourselves from it. As noted, a handful of individuals have played such an important role in the creation of our current system that their names must be mentioned. However, targeting individuals within the system isn't going to solve our problems. Even if only 1 out of 1,000 people are genius-level sociopaths, the percentage is probably much higher. That equals 7 million potential recruits for the network to draw from. In other words, there will always be an inexhaustible pool of replacements available to fill any tiny number of key-making posts within the system. For this reason, the predatory system itself must be destroyed. Fortunately for us, there is a vital target for us to strike, one foundational element that the entire system is built on and cannot stand without: the network's control of money. This is their primary weapon, and it is well within our power to take it from them. The vast majority of people, like you and me, don't think of money as a weapon. For us, it's simply something we can earn and then use to purchase products and much deeper understanding of what... Wait a minute. Yeah. For us, it is simply something that we earn and then use to purchase products and services. The network, on the other hand, has a much deeper understanding of what money is and how to wield its power. For them, money isn't about acquiring more material goods or services. It's about acquiring more control over the resources and instruments that govern human behavior. When viewed in this light, their seemingly insatiable desire to accumulate and control money makes more sense. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean that personal ownership of money is the network's most effective monetary weapon. In fact, we could take away the personal fortunes of all of its members, and if that's all we did, their power would remain undisturbed, and they would rebuild their fortunes in no time. This is because the network knows something that most of us do not. Control of money, not actual ownership, is what truly matters. Where you and I cannot imagine having the ability to control money that doesn't belong to us, the network cannot imagine having it any other way. In this chapter, we'll cover 3 primary mechanisms that the network uses to perpetuate its monetary power. These mechanisms are: number 1, the ability to combine and control the earnings of others. Tax. The ability to directly confiscate earnings of others. What was the word for that? Civil something. Number 3, the ability to create money out of thin air. Number 1, control of money. Wait a minute. Silly me. Number 1, combine and control money. Excuse me, I gotta fix something. right back. Getting a bit windy. Gotta put down. All right, we're back. Oh God. Righty-o. That looks better anyways. Okay. Combine and control money. Beginning on pages 50 and 51 of Tragedy and Hope, Quigley speaks of a group that employs financial capitalism to monopolize business and control government. As experts in financial manipulation, these men aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers, and according to Quigley, they succeeded at a level that rivaled the political dynasties of past centuries. Centered in London, with offshoots in New York and Paris, the power of this group is described as overwhelming in significance and occult in nature. By 1850, got a footnote here, it's worth noting that this period of financial capitalism clearly predates the Rhodes-created network that Quigley describes in both The Anglo-American Establishment and Tragedy and Hope. As such, it's reasonable to suggest that the real roots of the Rhodes Network and the real power existed long before Cecil Rhodes entered the picture. However, since this book focused on the proven conspiracy identified and exposed by Quigley, a detailed account of what existed before Rhodes will have to be told elsewhere. Moving on from 1850, they could access the immense monetary power of the stock exchange, the Bank of England, and the London money market. But this was just the beginning. In time, brought into their financial network commercial banks and savings banks, as well as insurance companies, to form all of these into a single financial system on an international scale, which manipulated the quantity and flow of money. Just to clarify, these men did not own the money the citizens placed in the commercial and savings banks. They did not own the money that the citizens paid into retirement funds, insurance funds, or trust funds. However, as already mentioned, they didn't need to own the money. All they needed was the power to control it, and that they had. As long as an institution within their financial network held the funds, they could direct those funds toward increasing their power. They alone determined how and where enormous international pool of money would be invested. Bankers, especially international investment bankers, were able to dominate both business and government. They could dominate business because investment bankers had the ability to supply or refuse to supply capital. They took seats on the boards of directors of industrial firms, as they had already done on commercial banks, savings banks, insurance firms, and finance companies. They funneled capital to enterprises which yielded control and away from those who resisted. Side note, Quigley points out that bankers have far less power over those who can finance their own operations. As such, any group seeking to create a ruling dynasty of such international bankers would be wise to create a system that is built on debt and undermines independent financing. Anything that devours or wipes out the wealth of outsiders will create endless opportunities for members of the dynasty who have an inexhaustible supply of money to loan, always with strings attached. The power of investment bankers over governments rests on a number of factors, of which the most significant, perhaps, is the need of governments to borrow money. Just as businessmen go to commercial banks for current capital advances, so a government has to go to merchant bankers, or institutions controlled by them, to tide over the shallow places caused by irregular tax receipts. As experts in government bonds, the international bankers not only handled the necessary advances, but provided advice to government officials and, on many occasions, placed their own members in official posts. In addition to their power over government based on financing and personal influence, bankers could steer governments in ways they wished them to go by other pressures. Since most government officials felt ignorant of finance, they sought advice from bankers whom they considered to be experts in the field. The history of the last century shows that the advice given to governments by bankers, like the advice they gave to industrialists, was consistently good for bankers, but was often disastrous for governments, businessmen, and the people generally. Such advice could be enforced if necessary by manipulation of exchanges, gold flows, discount rates, and even levels of business activity. To summarize, using enormous amounts of other people's money, international bankers essentially purchased their way into powerful business and government positions. With each new position, they gained control of more money. With control of more money, they gained access to more positions, so on and so forth. Through this process, they secured enough monetary power to enforce their advice on both business and governments alike, expanding the reach of their hidden dynasties each step of the way. This now brings us to the network's two crowning achievements of 1913: the federal income tax and the Federal Reserve System. If I can turn the page. Using governments as its instruments, the network granted itself the legal authority to create and directly confiscate the money it needs to finance its global objectives. The enormity of this topic, especially regarding the legal right to create money, requires hundreds of pages to cover properly. This chapter will provide only a short introduction. To fully understand the power derived from creating money, I highly recommend further research into the Federal Reserve System. For a good beginner's guide, read Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin. And he highly recommends The Creature from Jekyll Island. Now, if I can find my spot. Okay, for now, let's start with the easier of the two funding mechanisms. Not money creation, but money confiscation. Number 2, confiscate money. On page 938 of Tragedy and Hope, Quigley draws a flawed conclusion. He assumes that J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc. must have lacked control over the government in 1913. If they had more power, he suggests, they would have stopped the federal income tax from becoming law. Like so many others who've accepted the alleged purpose of the income tax, Quigley fails to put two and two together. An income tax that is paid into a system that the network controls only serves to strengthen the network's position. It creates another massive flow of other people's money to tap into. Even if high-ranking members like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc. had paid the income tax like everyone else, they'd still gain control over far more money than they paid in. The amount of money collected by the rest of the population each year ran into the billions by 1917, then the tens of billions by the end of by the end of the 1940s, then the hundreds of billions by the mid-1970s, and it runs into the trillions today. I would think quadrillions, but that's my opinion. Remember, they don't have to own that money to determine how it's spent. Of course, these men did not pay income taxes like everyone else. Instead, they used the government to establish tax-exempt foundations before the income tax became law. This not only enabled them to shield their own fortunes, but it also enabled them to gain further control over Ivy League education and the federal government itself. Remarkably, Quigley acknowledges the ultimate effect of the income tax and the tax-exempt foundations, but he doesn't seem to think much about it further. These tax laws drove the great private fortunes into tax-exempt foundations, which became a major link in the establishment network between Wall Street, the Ivy League, and the federal government. For insight on how the network really felt about the income tax, we can simply turn our attention back to E.M. Howes in his book, Philip Dru, Administrator. Written anonymously before the Income Tax Amendment was passed, Howes openly attacked the grotesque American Constitution because it prevented the government from collecting an income tax from its citizens. Shortly after Howes's choice for president, Woodrow Wilson, was placed in office, the grotesque constitutional barrier was removed, and the money began to flow. For insight into how the network really felt about the income tax, we can simply turn our attention back to E.M. Howes. In his book, Philip Dru, Administrator, written anonymously before the Income Tax Amendment was passed, Howes openly attacked the grotesque American Constitution because it prevented the government from collecting an income tax from its citizens. Shortly after Howes's choice wait a minute. Sorry. Moving on. Sadly, few Americans realized that the United States did not have a permanent personal income tax prior to 1913. Footnote: a temporary income tax was imposed by Lincoln to fund the Civil War in 1861. Though the tax outlived the war, it ended circa 1873 and attempted in 1894 to create a permanent income tax was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court a year later. See Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company. It wasn't until 1913, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, that our current federal income tax came to be. Now, where was I? Okay, 11. Think about that for a minute. America went from being a sparsely settled nation of wilderness in 1776 to the most prosperous and arguably most powerful nation on the planet without an income tax. Contrary to the popular canard, a lack of income tax does not mean your country is doomed, socially, politically, militarily, and economically, to the global status of Somalia. Here's another little known fact about the income tax. If we abolished the personal income tax today, the federal government would still collect about $3 billion per day, $125 million per hour in revenue, compared to its revenue in 1913 of less than $1 billion per year. And the absurdity of what the network has achieved becomes pretty clear. Even after adjusting for inflation, the numbers are still alarming. $1 billion per year in 1913 would equal about $25 billion per year today. At the current rate of federal spending, that inflation-adjusted $25 billion would be gone in a little over 2 days. All of this federal spending requires an ever-expanding river of money. Follow that river, and you'll find that it inevitably empties into an ocean of network-connected industries and interests. Even humanitarian government services like food stamps are handled by J.P. Morgan and generate millions of dollars for the firm. Start looking into the military-industrial complex, which serves the Ultimate Network's interests, its sovereignty destruction project, and the costs, financial and otherwise, boggle the mind. But as bad as all this is, we've still only scratched the surface. Yes, the income tax essentially handed the network a license to steal. Without its instrument, government, there would be no way to directly confiscate trillions of dollars annually from the labor of U.S. citizens. The power of this funding mechanism, which did not exist for nearly 140 years of our nation's history, has strengthened the network's global influence beyond measure. However, even on its best day, the so-called income tax runs a distant second to the greatest monetary power of all, the power to create money out of thin air. Number 3, create money. Create credit, inescapable debt. In the next chapter, we'll briefly cover the basic mechanics of creating money, credit, and inescapable debt. For now, let's cover something that's arguably more important and definitely easier to understand: the implications of possessing such incredible monetary power and the story of how the network seized it. First, the implications. We'll start small and work our way up. Can you imagine if a government gave you $100 million? Think about that for a minute. Tomorrow, at noon, the government has agreed to transfer $100 million into your bank account. No strings attached. Got it? Okay, let's go a little further. Can you imagine if the government gave you $500 million? How about $1 billion? Better yet, what if it simply decided to give you $1 trillion? It's difficult to get your mind around such large numbers, but really try to imagine what it would be like. For instance, if the government gave you $1 trillion and if you invested it, earning only a 7% annual return, you'd wind up with over $5.5 billion per month in additional income, roughly $192 million per day. Imagine having the ability to spend $192 million per day without ever depleting a penny of the $1 trillion you were given. How much power would you have? And with so much money to spend, how many individuals and institutions would want to be your friend? Now, let's take it one step further. What if the government gave you all of the dollars? What if you were given the exclusive right to create every single dollar that exists? Try to get your head around that concept. If the dollar exists anywhere in the world, it only exists because you were given the right to create it. Now, how much power do you have? The following quote provides a pretty good idea. I'm afraid the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can, and do, create money and policy of government, and holds in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. Reginald McKenna, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, as quoted in Tragedy and Hope. That statement is about as straightforward as it gets, and it comes from a man who had intimate knowledge of the topic. He worked at the highest levels within the system and is stating unequivocally exactly how it is. Those who create money and control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments, and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. So why is it, if creating money and controlling credit confer so much power, that so few people understand either of these topics? Shouldn't we all be taught the dangers of such power? Is it any surprise that we aren't? Again, Quigley provides some insight. He explains again. He explains that For the network to achieve its objectives, it was necessary to conceal or even to mislead both governments and people about the nature of money and its methods of operation. This practice of deceiving governments and people about money continues to this day because it's the only way for the network to maintain its current level of power. Rest assured, the vast majority of people do not understand what central banks are or how they operate. It's because they were not meant to. Our global monetary system was created by men who conceal and mislead as a matter of course. It's not only how they conduct their business, it's how they intend to secure their far-reaching aim reiterated below. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled by the central banks of the world acting in secret agreements. Each central bank, in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England and Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in their business world. Each country, the power the power of the central bank rested largely on its control of credit and money supply. It was for this purpose that the network created the Federal Reserve System. That's all we're doing for today. We'll pick this up later.